Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Mariam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. Good day, everybody. Today we are talking to Erin West. She's a librarian at the Lexington Public Library at the Central Library, one of the Kentucky Room staff. She's going to be talking about two famous Kentucky scientists, John James Audubon and Constantine Samuel Rafinesque. They had a quirky relationship and an odd encounter. So some funny interactions. So can you talk to us a little bit about Mr. Audubon and his background?
Absolutely. So John James Audubon was a famous naturalist and artist, and he specialized in birds. But in 1818, he pulled just an epic prank on Constantine Samuel Rafinesque, the full extent we just learned in the last couple of years. Rafinesque was a very eccentric naturalist who, in 1818, he was working his way down the Ohio River Valley and describing plants and animals that he found. He stayed with his fellow naturalists, which is how he came to be in the home of Audubon. So Rafinesque was this really weird guy. So he was a professor at Transylvania, but he would often miss his own classes because he spent so much time collecting specimens.
So your typical absent-minded professor, basically.
Yes, absolutely. He generally wore stained clothes. He had a giant waistcoat with huge pockets that he would just stuff specimens in. So oftentimes his clothes were wet from plant juices.
Yeah. I'd hate to be the one doing his laundry.
Yes, but over his career as a naturalist, he described over 6,000 new species of plants.
Wow.
So his obsession paid off. So imagine this wild-looking guy, big, bushy beard, juicy coat, shows up at your door with a letter of introduction that calls him an odd fish.
An odd fish. Okay.
Yes, an odd fish. Yeah. And he asks to stay with you. And Audubon lets him.
Henderson, Kentucky, correct?
Yes, Henderson, Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And Rafinesque ends up staying with him for about 8 days, which was fairly typical. But Audubon reports that it was more like 3 weeks.
It's all about perception.
Yes. We know from the next unsuspecting naturalist that Rafinesque stayed with that he was actually there about 8 days.
I'm sure it felt like 3 weeks to Audubon.
Yes, I'm sure it did. So it was fairly well known around the community that Audubon liked a good prank. In 1831, Audubon wrote about another incident that he pulled on this unsuspecting European visitor. He titled the incident in his book, The Traveler and the Polecat.
The Polecat, which is a skunk.
It is a skunk, yes. So the traveler sees this beautiful animal. It's all black with a yellow stripe down the back. And he says, "What a beautiful squirrel." And Audubon, being Audubon, says, "Oh, yes, it is a beautiful squirrel. And it's good-natured, too. So much so that if you pick it up wearing gloves, it'll let you."
Wow.
So, of course, this was not a squirrel. And the traveler goes and tries to pick up the animal and gets sprayed.
The quote-unquote squirrel.
The squirrel, yes. But Audubon realizes later that he completely miscalculated this prank because a winter storm hits and they have to take refuge together in a cabin. So the people that own the cabin flee. They make the traveler stick his coat outside, but Audubon gets to share a bed with him.
Wow. So his genius idea kind of backfired.
Yes, he really messed up with that one. Rafinesque was completely obsessed with finding new species. And the reason that he came to visit Audubon in the first place was he hoped that Audubon would have drawn some previously undescribed plants. Okay. Because he usually would draw some brush or shrub with his birds. So he decided to travel to meet Audubon and stayed with him. So with his obsession with new species and his trusting nature, it's reported all over that Rafinesque was pretty naive most of the time. He was a really easy target for Audubon's sense of humor.
Poor guy.
Yeah.
You kind of do feel sorry for him a little bit.
You do, yeah. What happened to make Audubon decide to pull this prank on poor naive Rafinesque was that Rafinesque smashed his prized Cremona violin.
Oh, we know that Audubon was really into music and art, and
yes.
So, yeah.
Yep.
It must have been really special to him.
So Audubon described this incident in his book, Ornithological Biography, in 1831. So it's the middle of the night, and Audubon and the rest of his family is fast asleep when they're suddenly awoken by a great uproar in Rafinesque's room. So they rush in, throw open the door, and they find Rafinesque running around with the neck of this violin, completely naked, trying to smash bats that had come in the room. So the bits of the violin body were just all over the floor. He completely smashed. And he's using the remains of it to try to smack these bats so that he can collect them and describe them, because he's convinced they are completely new species.
As opposed to leaving the room and leaving the bats to themselves.
Yes. So Audubon just decides to watch him exhaust himself. And finally, Rafinesque just begs him for help to collect these bats. And these bats are so battered that Audubon takes up the neck of the violin and just gives each one like a good whack. And it's over. And he describes the room as just being a complete mess. All of the new plant specimens were all over the floor. So Audubon decides he's going to be helpful and try to pick them up. But Rafinesque tells him, no, never mind. Don't worry about those. I'll arrange them again. So, I have the bats and that's enough. And
that was important.
Yes, that was what was important to him, is the bats. Audubon leaves. No apology from Rafinesque. No even mention of using the violin as a weapon. As it turned out, at least a couple of these bat species were new. And Rafinesque describes having found them in Henderson.
Okay, at least it's not for nothing.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So for one of the species, he even says it often comes in the house at night. So Audubon's story is at least partially true. So I'm sure you're wondering now, what did Audubon do to get back at him for this? He made up 28 new species. Just made them up and described them to Rafinesque, completely exploiting his obsession with brand new species. Wow. So the breakdown of this is 11 fake fish, 3 fake snails, 2 fake birds, 1 fake mollusk, 2 fake plants, and 9 fake rats.
Wow.
Yes.
That's a creative person.
Yes. It's reported that Rafinesque did have some doubts about these species, but not really about whether or not they existed. Just in some of the small details. Maybe Audubon got some of the details wrong, but that these things were real.
But he would investigate, right? He's going to investigate.
Yes. One of these fish species was supposedly bulletproof.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
He didn't suspect that part. No,
that was fine. A rock-covered fish that could swim was completely normal. And it actually wasn't until the 1870s that the 11 fish were identified as fakes. So the bulletproof fish made it in as a species all the way up to 1870.
Wow.
So decades after both men had died. So Rafinesque, luckily, for the fish anyway, attributed them to Audubon. Other scientists were able to say, oh, well, Audubon described these to him. Audubon made these up.
Yeah.
Which didn't help Audubon's reputation either.
Not really, yeah. But preserved Rafinesque's reputation.
A little bit, yeah. They decided that the other animals that were odd, they just kept attributing them to Rafinesque's fertile imagination. So the ones that weren't credited to Audubon in his published writing, they kept those as he made them up.
Oh, goodness.
Neil Woodward at the Smithsonian recently was going back through Rafinesque's journals, and he found the rest of these fake species he had in his private journals attributed them also to Audubon from this trip. So he has spent a couple of years going through and finding all of the fakes. And that's how it came out that there were 28 fake. Like I said before, Audubon didn't get away with this prank scot-free. Of course, after his death in the 1870s, scientists really started looking more critically at his work also. And they found 5 birds that didn't currently exist and accused him posthumously of making them up.
Yeah.
But the
that didn't work out well.
No, So it's equally possible that they're fakes or they just don't exist anymore.
Maybe they're extinct.
Yeah, or just a rare color variant or a mutation. But the question remains because now he has a history of faking species. But Rafinesque, it didn't seem to bother him at all. He
seems like a pretty happy-go-lucky guy, kind of go with the flow. So it wouldn't bother him.
Yeah, so he just goes on obsessively cataloging new species. He left Transylvania and Lexington in 1826 after his proposal for a botanic garden was abandoned by the state legislature and several disagreements with the president of Transylvania. When you don't show up and teach your own classes, you tend not to have a good relationship with your boss.
With the students. Or
He ended up moving to Philadelphia, and he lived there the rest of his life. And even in a private letter in 1832, he proposed an early theory of evolution before Charles Darwin.
Oh, wow.
And Darwin later credited Rafinesque's idea in the 3rd edition of On Origin of Species.
Yeah, so he did contribute a lot to science.
He did, yes.
Biology and all that.
Yeah. And then,
despite his absent-mindedness.
Yes. And then in 1827, a big-eared bat, which is native to the southeast United States, was named for Rafinesque, and it's now used by Transylvania University as their mascot, and they've named it Raf.
That's good. That's a good bit of history to know. Yeah.
And then in 1924, a society of people decided to try to find Rafinesque's remains in Philadelphia and bring them back to Transylvania to mollify his spirit. They felt like because he'd left under a cloud that his spirit was responsible for several bad things that had happened
in Transylvania.
Including Old Morrison burning down a couple of times.
Yeah.
So they brought
a few plagues and
Yes. So they brought these bones back thinking that would mollify his spirit, and they've buried him in Old Morrison under the words, "Honor to whom honor is overdue."
Yeah.
The only problem is that it's really probably not Rafinesque at all. But they tried, and Old Morrison hasn't burned down since he's been back.
Well, that's good. At least that worked.
Yes.
Maybe. Yeah. Well, thank you, Erin. Thank you for that good bit of history and fun. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Mariam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.